Welcome. I'm Kinetic Symphony. I hunt down and report on mysterious and weird, true stories, from glitches to the paranormal. This is my channel's weekly compendium, ending Monday, May 2nd, 2022. Case file number 606, written by Carrig Frizz Warrior. When one step equals thousands. I experienced a time glitch about 5 years ago, and I'm still trying to figure out if there's a rational explanation. At the time, I was working in an office in Cork City Centre, and the car park I used was over a kilometer away. There were a few different routes from the office to the car park, but it was all uphill on the way back to the car. If I took the shortest route and really rushed, practically ran, on a nice day, it would take at least 9 minutes. If I walked at my usual pace, it would take up to 14 minutes as there are several roads that need to be crossed. The day in question, I left the office along with 3 of my work colleagues. We left at 5 p.m. I checked with the others later, and yes, we left at exactly 5 p.m. The 4 of us walked part of the way together, and then the other 3 branched off as they used another nearer and more expensive car park. At the time, I used to walk to the car park to practice mindfulness. I tuned into my surroundings, listened to the sounds, looked at the people, experienced being in the moment, etc., etc. I remember climbing the steep stone steps on Kaiser's Quay beside Elizabeth Fort, and the next thing I was aware of was rounding the corner onto Tower Street. I got into my car totally confused. There was a big gap on my route. I got into my car, and the time in my car was showing as 5:07. Same on my watch. I turned on the car radio. Time check announced 7 minutes past 5. I could not have gotten there that fast, particularly as the first part of the walk included chatting with 3 work colleagues slowly. I racked my memory for the walk to the car, and there's a huge gap. I have no memory at all of walking along several of the streets. What is particularly strange is that one of my neighbors works in a dentist surgery along the route, and I would have usually waved in the window to her as I passed, so I would always look to see if she was still working, but I have no memory whatsoever of this section of the route. I would also add that Cork City is pretty old, and the area I was walking in is one of the oldest sections. Did I walk into some time loop and get spat out in a different place? I have thought about this over and over, but I cannot explain it. Case notes, file number 606. Right, we can eliminate a few things commonly associated with time glitches. Aliens? Sadly, highly unlikely given the packed density of a city combined with it only being 5 p.m. We can also eliminate a mind glitch like spacing out, suddenly sleepwalking, or sleep running because you got to your destination far faster than should be possible, even if you ran at top speed, because the first half of the walk you were walking slowly with your coworkers. The only mundane method to cover that distance would be in a vehicle, but why would someone pick you up, of which you have no memory? Maybe hypnotism? There have been a few accounts of people being hypnotized suddenly, often by old ladies, but that doesn't quite fit right. What's the motive here? So, the only explanation that fits in my mind is a space-time portal. This usually seems to happen to drivers, one instant at point A, then at point B miles away. I suppose there's no reason it couldn't happen to someone just walking along too. That must be what happened. It does raise another question though. Why would a random space-time portal take you exactly where you needed to be? Why not 1,000 miles away in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, for instance? Or hell, under the ocean itself, instantly crushing you from the pressure. Due to how these portals seem to behave, I'm guessing they aren't random. They seem to be calibrated exactly so you appear still on the surface of the planet and not too far away. Or maybe that's survivorship bias? Maybe they are random and people are literally walking or driving to their deaths all the time as a result. And those are more missing 411 persons reports instead of glitch in the Matrix stories. Case file number 607, written by The Third Heat, 369. A Star-Spangled Glitch. It was July 4th, 2011, and obviously in the US, that's Independence Day. So I got together with a group of friends to go out. I had an early shift the following day, so I decided I shouldn't drink. The night was fun, but at around 8, I decided I should try to get back to my side of town before the fireworks started because I figured traffic and drunk driving would get worse if I stayed at my friend's house until after the fireworks. So I'm driving up this narrow side street going up towards my house. But this side street is one many of the locals use to get from my neighborhood to our south side, which is a major drinking and partying hotspot. Anyway, I had on this very distinctive and obnoxious American flag shirt where the body's part had red and white stripes and the arms were blue with white stars. I bought the shirt from a thrift store and have never seen anyone wear something similar, but who knows. Anyway, as I'm driving down the street, I see what looks like a woman with a similar shirt as mine, passed out, face down on the sidewalk. Like she looked like something was very seriously wrong too, as if she face planted into the ground or something. So I decided to pull over and go check on her, but because the street is so narrow, you can't just double park. You have to go and find a place to pull over. I park down the block and go back to help this lady. I have been down this road many times throughout my life, so I know the landmarks well, and I knew exactly where she had been laying. Also, even though I had to park down the street, I literally ran back to her. It couldn't have been more than 3 or 4 minutes max. I get to where I knew I saw her, and there's nothing. No sign of anyone, no one walking down the street or anything. It was so bizarre, and I got chills. I decided to drop it and go back to my car. As I'm getting ready to cross the street again, this car comes speeding up the street towards me, and before I could even think, it crashes smack into the retaining wall right by where I was just standing literally seconds before. Then this nutjob backs out and drives off. So one of the neighbors came out and we called the police, and I helped file a police report and then went home. When I got home, I called my mom to tell her about what had happened because I was still so shaken up. And she's the one who started putting things together and made me really think about this as if it's a glitch in the Matrix. She felt like I had somehow witnessed some alternate reality where I saw myself dead on the sidewalk, because in that reality, maybe a car struck me earlier than the car that arrived in this dimension. I don't know. I didn't really know what to make of it then, and I suppose I still don't. But coming here on Reddit today makes me think that maybe it was just another glitch in the Matrix. Bonus file, written by Zuzu of the Wolves, in the Root of Horror. In September, my partner and I signed the lease on a dream apartment. I was ridiculously excited and kept telling everyone I knew all about it, to the point where I was probably actually pretty annoying. One day, a friend of mine came to visit me at work, and of course I told her the news of our new place. She asked me where it was, and when I told her the location, she turned pale and seemed uncomfortable at best and flat out scared at worst. She asked to see a picture of the inside, and when I showed her, she let out a long sigh of relief, then proceeded to tell me one of the creepiest stories I've ever heard. It turns out that about 5 years ago, she had lived in the house directly next to mine with her sister and boyfriend. Starting almost immediately when they moved in, they began hearing noises out in the kitchen area at night when they were sleeping, and occasionally woke up to open cabinets or kitchen tools scattered around. Eventually, they started hearing what sounded like kids talking in low voices in the kitchen at night, occasionally crying, and crashes that sounded far off but still somewhere in the house. Around this time, my friend and her sister started to fight a lot and said that they had both been feeling extremely irritable about everything. Their house was broken into while they were all at work one night, but nothing was stolen except some cheap costume jewelry. There was cash, valuable jewelry, and designer clothing in the house, but it was all left untouched. Later in the same month, they received a visit from the cops, who said a neighbor had called about screaming and crying coming from the house, and they had reported that they left their kids there alone when they went out. Only one problem: they didn't have kids. The cops were called a few other times and finally got a search warrant, and somehow ended up finding a trap door under the kitchen window area that was covered in a layer of leaves and dirt. They found out that it was the remnants of a very, very old root cellar. I live in one of the oldest cities in America by European colonizer standards, and much of the structures are built on top of older structures. Apparently, one thing led to another in the search down there, and the police recovered some very old skeletal remains of 2 children. Nobody seemed to know if the skeletons or the root cellar were there first. During all of this, my friend and her sister broke their lease and moved out of there ASAP, as they were terrified to be there any longer in the presence of such tragedy. I went through with my lease and I live in the building next door to where all this happened. My apartment is an old adobe market that was converted into an apartment in the 70s, and it's been an absolute dream to live in. No scary vibes or noises at all. The couple who lived in that house now seem pretty nice and keep to themselves. We all have high privacy walls and coyote fences, and I feel tempted to see if they know all about this, but I'm afraid it might make them uncomfortable if I approach them about it. Bonus file, written by Avery Matthews. The devil went to our school. I'll give some background before I tell you the encounters I had. I went to an all-boys boarding school from the age of 8 until just after my 18th birthday. My school was old, and I mean old. It was founded over 450 years ago, back in 1552. To put that into a little context for my American friends, that's 245 years before the USA was even founded. With a place that old, it carries things. As you can probably imagine, I have a lot of stories from my 5 years of service at my school. Feel free to ask any questions. First encounter. The way my schooling worked was perhaps a little confusing to most. You started boarding in junior school at age 8, and then you would be moved to senior school at age 13. My junior school was a relatively new addition to the school, and I never had any paranormal encounters when I was growing up there. My first encounter happened in my first year of senior school. I was 13 and still getting used to my new senior workload, so I felt a little tired and overburdened as I was getting used to my new work schedule. But I was making friends with some of the boys in my year and things were looking up. At this point, I was probably the smallest boy in my year. I hadn't hit my growth spurt yet, and I wouldn't for a couple more years. The older boys in our schoolhouse would tell us stories of how the school was haunted, and that we should never adventure alone past sunset. My friends and I did not believe them in the slightest. We assumed that they were just playing tricks on the new boys, but we were so wrong. I remember the first time something odd happened. I was quite under the weather and at a high temperature. This was within my first month of moving into the school. My teacher suggested I should take a cold shower. It was late in the evening and showers were usually reserved for the first thing in the morning unless you had PE that day. I remember feeling rather dizzy, and so my friend offered to accompany me. We went down to the shower room together. Having showers at my school was probably the most awkward thing I remember about my time there. One big open room with a dozen or so shower heads. That was a tough thing to get used to when I first started boarding at 8 years old, but I did get used to it rather quickly. I was never really shy about my body or anything like that, but still, there were at least 2.5 dozen boys in my schoolhouse, all crammed together in a completely open, communal shower room. It was awkward to say the least. But back to the point, when my friend and I went down late in the evening, we placed our clothes under a shower head that wasn't going to be used by either of us and got in the shower. The hot water boiler would not have been on at that time in the evening, so my cold shower certainly was cold. After around 5 minutes, my friend and I stood in the freezing cold water. All at once, every unused shower turned on full blast. As well as that, the freezing water suddenly turned boiling hot, like red hot, dangerously so. I'm sure if my friend and I didn't manage to get out of the way of the water before it reached full temperature, we would have been burnt badly. We immediately made a run for the door of the shower room, but it was locked and we couldn't get it opened. We started panicking, as you could imagine. Remember, the scene is 2 naked 13-year-old boys slamming on the shower door with all we could muster. Then, almost as fast as they all started, the showers all stopped. I remember that my heart was racing like it had never raced before. I remember feeling as if I was drowning in steam from the showers. After that, the showers started spurting out something that looked like bright red blood, and I won't ever forget the smell, like rusty metal mixed with sewage. My friend and I were truly cowering at the door by this point. I'll speak for myself when I say that was the scariest thing I'd ever experienced up until that point in my life. Then again, the water stopped and the door unlocked. Our clothes were truly ruined, along with our towels. My teachers were very strict. They could be downright mean. You do not want to be punished at my school. And that's what terrified us more in that moment. We were more scared of being sent to the headmaster's office than we were of whatever event just happened, paranormal or not. So we did our best to clean up, but it didn't work. The room still looked as if a bomb had been dropped, so we went to our head of house and explained what happened, or tried to. He seemed confused, perhaps even slightly scared. He told us to go back to our dorm. The next day, the shower room was closed, and we had to use another house's room. As I said, this was probably the first time I experienced something that I cannot explain. Whether it was paranormal or not, which personally I'm almost certain it was. How else would all the showers turn themselves on and the door lock itself? This is only one story from my 5 years at my school, and honestly, this is one of the mildest. On to the second encounter. This takes place around 2 months after the last incident with the showers. It was the first Christmas holiday, and most boys were packing up to spend 2 weeks at home with their parents. My parents had already written to me and they said they were too busy for me to come home, so I would be spending the holiday there. I have to admit I was disappointed, but I did as I was told. All of the friends I had made left for the holiday, so I was pretty lonely, but I was enjoying some rest time. For those of you who don't know how most boarding schools in Britain work, we had a 6-day week. We had normal lessons all day from Monday through Saturday, and on Sunday, we had to attend a church service for the first half of the day, meaning we only got one afternoon off to rest in the week, so I spent most of the time I was allowed to in bed reading books. The weird things were more prominent when it was the holidays. It was as if whatever energies were there became braver when there were less people around. In my schoolhouse, around 2.5 dozen boys, but only 4 had stayed for the holiday. Only 1 was the same age as me, and none had stayed from my dorm room, which I have to admit I was thrilled about. Well, I was at first, anyway. The first couple or so nights went fine. I was doing my 13-year-old boy thing, and I won't go into any more detail about that. But after the first days of peace, the weird things started again. At first, it wasn't anything major. Echoes of screams and moans coming from the courtyard. But I rationalized it as older boys playing pranks. But it did scare me. Yet I didn't want to appear weak or fall into the prank. So I slept through my fears and I didn't ask any of the other boys to come and sleep in my dorm with me. So I slept, and when I woke, every other bed in my dorm apart from mine had been moved to the far side of the dorm, which thoroughly freaked me out. But again, I assumed it was a prank from some of the older boys. And if it's one thing I had learned by this point, if you're being pranked or joked on in any way, show no weakness, or it will keep happening. So I moved all the beds back myself, and I went down for a shower. When I got down there was another boy already in the shower room. I can't remember exactly how old he was, but he was in the older years, so probably around 15 or 16. For this story, I'll name him Toby. By this point, I was used to showering with others, so I didn't care that he was there at all. He told me his plan for sneaking down at night and breaking into the dessert kitchen and having a midnight feast. He asked if I wanted to join him, and though I had never done anything against the rules before, he assured me that he had done it loads and had never been caught, so I agreed. Later that day, I got ready in a suit of all black to be able to sneak around more effectively. Toby was just wearing his normal clothes and looked at me like I was a huge nerd when I explained my reasoning for my clothes, and so we started sneaking down to the kitchen. When we got there, we started eating as much ice cream as we could. When suddenly a whole shelf of tin food threw itself onto the floor and the kitchen doors slammed themselves shut. I looked at Toby in a "what do we do" kind of way. We picked up food and left almost as quickly as we came. Toby and I started walking back towards our schoolhouse. This is the bit that still gives me the chills. We heard footsteps coming up the hall on the way back. We assumed this would be a teacher, but we found somewhere to hide until he had passed. But no one came and we carried on walking back towards our dorm. This is when I felt something grab my leg and yank it. I got back up. We looked around us and there was no one around. We started running because we both were scared when something yanked Toby's leg. He fell, and he fell way worse than I did and banged the front of his head and gave him a bloody nose. He got back up relatively quickly. He was a rugby boy and was used to this kind of thing. By this point, we were sprinting full speed back to our schoolhouse. We got back. We swore we wouldn't speak of what happened again out of fear of getting into trouble. I went to my dorm and tried to get to sleep, but I was terrified of what had just happened. After a couple hours of just laying, I managed to get to sleep. I woke up at some point in the night to my bed, along with the others in my dorm, being slammed into the far side of the room with force. At this point, I was completely over having my own dorm room. I got up and went into Toby's dorm. I explained what happened in my dorm to someone I thought would understand me. He told me that he knew what I was talking about, and he told me to make a bed in his dorm, and I slept there for the rest of the holiday. On the plus side, Toby looked out for me during the time he was at the school, and we still keep in touch now. The third and final encounter. This event happened in the summer of my first year, meaning I was 14 years old and the school year was almost over. At this point, you've already heard a few of the other events that had transpired. However, nothing had happened in so long that I was beginning to move on from it all. Toby, my friend, would still check up on me from time to time, and we had made a promise that we would come to each other first if we thought anything paranormal was going on. Toby was a very comforting person, and I felt very safe when he was around me. I woke up at 6:30 a.m., and my dorm all headed down to the shower room to get ready for the day. All seemed normal, until we finished showering when we noticed that all of the clothes and towels that we had brought down with us had vanished. Obviously, our first thought was that some of the boys from the older year groups had taken them as a prank, which I suppose is possible, and probably what I would have believed if I didn't know any better. We tried sticking our heads through the shower room door for a bit and shouting that we needed some help, but either no one heard or no one cared enough to help us. And so, we were stuck naked in the shower room with no clothes or towels. Eventually, my friend, who I will call Peter, volunteered to head out of the shower room and back to our dorm so he could get some clothes for the rest of us. Around 3 minutes after Peter left, we heard the most horrific scream. A scream filled with pain and fear. A scream that echoed through the halls. Us boys didn't know what to do. We still had no clothes and we hoped it was just a mistake and that Peter would stop in a moment. For what felt like an endless 10 seconds, we all froze. Then almost as fast, we snapped back. We ran to our friend. I remember feeling my heartbeat in my throat as we found him collapsed on the floor, trying to drag himself back towards us. The bone in his leg was sticking out of his skin. The moment I saw it, I could feel my head go light. I felt dizzy, and if it wasn't for one of my other friends grabbing me, I think I would have collapsed myself. Peter was still screaming as he looked at us and said 5 words that still sent shivers down my spine. "Get me away from him!" By this point, a group of teachers had found us. We were taken back to our dorm and told to get dressed. The headmaster called us all in for questioning, where we explained what happened, but of course he didn't believe us. His theory was that we thought it would be funny to streak naked around the school after our showers, but since we were wet, Peter slipped and broke his leg. No matter how many times we tried to explain ourselves, he didn't listen. Peter had to go to hospital, and after our punishment period was over, we were allowed to visit him. I asked him what had happened, and he told us that on his way to the dorm, he had seen the devil in our school, and that if we hadn't arrived there in time, that the devil was going to kill him. Having spoken to Peter before writing this post, he still believes that the devil was there at our school that day. After some of the things that I experienced, I have no reason to doubt him. Something that I have noticed while retelling some of my stories, a lot of them have centered around or started in the shower room. Our schoolhouse's shower room was the oldest part of the building, but there was something more to the shower room than that. The stories of things that first and second year boys would be put through in the name of initiations to their house didn't need a paranormal aspect to be horrifying, and those initiations were only officially put a stop to a couple years before I joined the school. Those things being stopped is one of the only things I'm grateful for about my time at boarding school. But what a time it was. Case notes, bonus file. So as I was reading this, my mind was adrift with possibilities of the paranormal, but I never considered the devil. It's interesting to ponder, isn't it? I'm not very religious myself. I consider myself agnostic. I don't know if the devil and God and heaven and which religion would be true or not. I'm open to any possibility though. In this case, do I think it was the actual manifestation of the devil? No, I don't. I don't think the devil, if he exists, would bother with just a plain old boarding school. But I do think if there was a spirit there that was malevolent, or maybe a demon, that they could impersonate the devil. I mean, why not? Who knows if it's even what the devil truly looks like? I mean, we only have our own imaginations to work from, what we think the devil looks like, you know, the red skin and the horns and all that. But whatever was there, clearly was malevolent. Imagine the amount of negative energy required to turn water boiling hot and then into blood and sewage. It's not like he could have crossed some plumbing together and then somehow there's blood in it. There's no blood plumbing as far as I know. So yeah, that's one of the most evil things I've ever heard of. I'm glad you got out of there safely. I think I would have run away. Case file number 608, written by Natty Kin Z. Thank God it's Friday. This happened several years ago at TGI Fridays in Killeen, Texas. I was eating with my family when we saw our friend Jesse sitting at the bar across the restaurant. Jesse is easy to spot, with broad shoulders and a distinct widow's peak, and he was even wearing a green striped shirt such as he often wore. We called out to him, but he didn't hear us. Some guy he was sitting with noticed and told him we were trying to get his attention, so Jesse started walking towards us. And it was only when he came within about 10 feet of us that I realized it wasn't really him. He was almost identical, but not quite. Of course, this poor guy looked very confused to be summoned to a table full of strangers. Embarrassed, I apologized and explained that we had thought he was our friend Jesse. He was understanding, but then explained that his name was Jesse. So it had been extra confusing that we seemed to know him, but he didn't know us. It was some time later that we were eating at TGI Fridays again when I caught sight of a server and immediately smiled and raised my hand to greet her. I knew her very well, not as a server, but as someone significant enough in my life that I'd actually hung out with her. As she seemed to look right through me, I put my hand down and figured I must be wrong. But I was so confused because the feeling I had was so strong that I knew who she was. It drove me crazy, but there was nothing I could do about it. She then turned out to be our server. She took my dad's order first, and then when she turned to me, her eyes widened and she said, "I know you. How do I know you?" I went through every possible scenario we could think of and never could figure out how our paths had crossed. And I can guarantee you, they just had not. We covered all bases, and even if we had passed each other in a store or something, it would not explain the intense familiarity we both felt. I began to joke about the mysticism of that particular TGI Fridays. After the double Jesse experience, two friends of mine, each in an unrelated event, encountered other doubles and told me about it. I'd told them we were going to start calling it Doppelganger Fridays. Of course, this all seems like pure coincidence. But it's just interesting that it keeps happening at the same place. Case notes, file number 608. I've never been to a TGI Fridays before, and I've never seen my doppelganger either. I feel so left out. Now, that Jesse encounter could be pure coincidence, though it's indeed a large and trippy coincidence nevertheless, with the same name even. The fact people keep encountering their lookalikes, though probably not actual doppelgangers because they're not exactly the same looking, makes me think there's something about the location of that specific TGI Friday that is attracting specific people to it. I think your instincts were correct, it's about the location. It almost feels like what a trickster or a particularly funny server developer would do to mess with people's minds. I know because it's something I intend to do if I ever ascend to Universal Server Developer. Or at least a server mod. Come on, you guys up there? You hear me? I want in. Give me all the power. I won't abuse it. Well, not too much. Case file number 609, written by Beyond Sight, 7-11. Double lives, double deaths. Here's a little backstory so you know where I'm coming from. Years ago, I went to private school, which would have been great, but I noticed a few things that were off. I should have left well enough alone, but I didn't. Needless to say, I discovered wrongdoings and became the target. I was mentally abused, locked in rooms and bullied into silence by a so-called holy man. I have not seen this man in 20 years. 2 weeks ago, I was struck with the notion he was going to pass away. I look on social media to find he's been hospitalized. I called my mom and told her I had a feeling he's going to pass away. The following Monday, it is posted of his passing. I screenshotted the announcement and made some phone calls. I sent the picture to my brother, who asked me to remove the image because he doesn't want to see him, as we were all targets of his holy hate. 3 days later, I see a post asking for everyone to pray for him again as he has been hospitalized. I read and reread the post. I go to look for the announcement of his passing from 3 days prior, and it's gone. It's no longer in my screenshots. The conversation with my brother is still present though, with the remove message tag from where I had sent the images as the only evidence that existed. He passed away last Monday, again, just like he did in the following Monday. The same image was posted again, along with all the same comments of how he was such a great man, which I read all over again. So I'm not sure if this is classified as a glitch, or if you lead double lives, you die twice. Once for the man you are, and again for the man they all thought you were. Bonus file, written by KS Ghostly Girl, The Early Morning Ghost. For some background, I currently work as a service writer for a local repair shop, and I've recently been the first one into the office in the mornings. Our building is older and in a downtown area of our town. It's housed several shops over the years. A few weeks ago, my boss started joking about the ghost that scared one of our techs on a closing shift by banging around. We all laughed it off as an old building being creaky, recent plumbing issues, roofing issues, and etc. Shortly after that, I started hearing the banging occasionally when I was in a shop alone opening. For some context, our office sits elevated over a storage area, and some of our bays sit lower than the office itself. It sounded like the banging was coming directly from under my desk. It was unsettling, but it wasn't happening every morning, so it was easy enough to write off. This morning, I was in the office alone again and had just arrived, so hadn't turned on any lights yet. The only lights were from outside and some of the lights we leave on in the bays. As I went into the break room to put my lunch away, the banging started. I continued through my routine, but instead of calming down as usual, the banging picked up and almost sounded like it was moving around. I finally couldn't stand it anymore, so I opened the window to the bays and leaned out to see if I could see any reason at all that would explain it. Right as I was leaning, back out of the corner of my eye, I saw my chair roll across the room. As soon as it hit the wall, the banging stopped. I was half tempted to wait for the rest of our crew outside, but managed to hold it together. I definitely don't want to be alone anymore. Case file number 610, written by VRoll95. More candy than I ever bargained for. There was an old lady that sat close to the entrance of a huge mall near my home, selling different types of candy. She seemed very poor and fragile, at least 80 years old, and in the multiple times I would pass through her, my heart would always break a little. I would want to buy some candy from her to help her out, but now we live in the world of credit cards and I would never have change on me. One time, I even expressed this feeling of regret to my girlfriend when we went to watch a movie in that mall. She said she felt the same, that she would picture her grandmother in a situation like that and feel sad too. Then, a couple months ago, I was going to the mall to buy some cooking utensils with my mother, who was visiting me at the time. I saw the old lady again, selling her candy, and passed by. But when we were almost at the store, I remembered that this time I had a bunch of coins and a couple dollars in my wallet, so I went back. I showed her all the money I had on me and asked how much candy it could buy. I got a Mentos and 4 pieces of bubblegum. I showed her the candy and asked if that amount was okay. Her eyes were barely open. Her voice was low and raspy, but she smiled a little and said something like, "Yes, son, don't worry. God bless." I went back to join my mom, feeling a little better. Now, ever since I'm little, I have loved candy. My grandma would buy boxes of this stuff, and she would have to hide it so I wouldn't eat it all in a day, especially gum. I go through them really fast. So in about 10 minutes I was done with all the 4 pieces of bubblegum and reached to my pocket to start eating the Mentos. But when I took my hand out of the pocket, there were 4 additional pieces of bubblegum on my hand, on top of the box of Mentos. We were walking through the store and I stopped in my tracks. I explained what had happened to my mom, but she just laughed and dismissed me. I distinctly remember counting all the candy to make sure I wouldn't take any more than my money's worth, and even showing it to the old lady. It is very minor, especially compared to the other stories in the sub, but it made me feel nice. I think about it a lot still, and it makes me feel a little curious and good. I never saw the old lady sitting there ever again. What does this mean? Case file number 611, written by Please Don't M. I know what death feels like. Last year, my cat Snoopy got hit by a car and died. We lived in a very rural area in Germany, directly next to an elementary school, so I was not worried about letting him out alone. One day, I let him out in the morning. I remember being a bit worried because he had some diarrhea, but nothing serious, and I just went on my laptop. Later that morning, it was like a thought had struck me, and all I could think was, Snoopy is dead, just out of nowhere. I ignored it and did some breathing because I had felt like someone was dying before, mostly my dad or a friend of his killing themselves, so I just thought it was one of those weird moments. I usually check in with my dad when that happens, just in case, or maybe because I want to keep him from doing it. He's bipolar, so it would make sense. I had never felt any of that for my cat though. Anyways, after a few hours, I hear someone knocking on the door and my mom answering it. I hear her say, "Oh no," and then walk up to my door and I'm thinking, wouldn't it be insane if Snoopy was actually dead? He was. The only thing I could reply to my mom was, I knew it. When I went out to get him, he was lying on the side of the street next to our house, completely cold and starting to smell. He must have died a few hours before that, around the time I had that strange feeling. Needless to say, I still check in with my dad when I get that weird feeling. Case notes, file number 611. There's a known phenomenon, especially in those with high empathy, where they can legitimately feel the pain of others. Our brains can replicate certain sensations of sorrow, grief, sometimes even physical pain of those around us who we love if they're suffering. Whenever this is studied, it's always with visual examples, direct sight, or at least written and acknowledged. Still, those empathy centers can light up as long as the information is received to the brain, even if it's subconscious. I don't know exactly how the information is being received into our brains, but there's no denying at this point that we are able to receive it for those to whom we're connected to, across great distances even. Countless stories I've read of people knowing something is wrong with their spouse or parents, even grandparents. They literally feel it, feeling of dread. And yes, even our pets. My bet is it's dependent on how active they are in our minds. The more we think about them, the more pronounced the connection is, and the more visceral it hits us if something happens to them. In many cases, it's gut-wrenching. Rest in peace, Snoopy. Creepy file number 17, written by Zim Beam. When the forest stalks its prey. At the time this happened, I was a 13-year-old female. So this happened 2 years ago and I was fairly naive. I was a major introvert, only friends with a few people in my class. I wanted to be social, but I preferred to be alone and read or write. Classic nerd things. In early November, I got a text on my phone that was from a few classmates whose phone numbers I had, and around 1 or 2 I couldn't recognize. It was a group chat, asking if we wanted to hang out at night near a park at our school. My parents, being strict and paranoid, would never let me go. Luckily, or what I thought was luck, they were heading out for an overnight trip. They would be back around 4 in the morning. Everything fell into place, I guess. Once my parents left around 8-ish, I ran out the door and made my way to the park. The one thing I made sure to do was lock the door. My parents were paranoid after all, and it was their biggest thing that they engraved into me, lock the door. Once I arrived at the park, I noticed a creepy figure near the edge of the woods. No one else seemed to notice it, and I already had enough reputation as a weirdo who was true crime obsessed, so I didn't mention it. The night drew on, and I was having the time of my life, ignoring the gut feeling I had telling me to run. Every so often, I would look over my shoulder, and the man would still be standing there. Around 9:45, 4 of the 10 people there had to leave due to their curfew. It was getting cold and was nearly pitch black, with a few streetlights every so often. The rest of us decided to go as well, since it felt more eerie and quiet now. The place we were hanging out at was a field that was fenced in with a few exits and entrances. A large, wide field with a small park in the back and our giant middle school behind us. The front of the field faced the empty road, and the right and left sides were surrounded by forest. All of the people left were getting picked up by cars, meaning that they went the opposite way of the road, since that's where the parking lot was. The man stood by the right forest/road exit that I needed to take to get home. I walked away from my group and tried to steady my heavy breathing. I didn't want to be paranoid, but all the true crime I listened to was catching up to me. The man was probably late 30s to early 40s, dark hair with a beard. He was probably around average height, 5'9", but at the time it seemed like he was a giant, 6 foot tall at least. He stood about 10 feet from the exit I had to take, so when I got close enough to it, I ran for about 30 feet through the exit and through the woods. Once I felt safe enough, I started just to quickly walk through the woods, or at least get to the road. I heard a snap and a crunch from behind me. I stopped walking for a second and quickly checked over my shoulder. Around 15 feet behind me stood the very same man. He was walking slowly behind me, almost as if he was trying not to be suspicious, but it only made my fear worse. I turned around and walked so quickly I was basically jogging. I lived about 10 minutes away from the park we had hung out at, and I wasn't athletic enough to run home. After around 7 minutes of walking fast, I was in my neighborhood. I knew that I could run to my house if I had to, from here, so I checked to see if he was still trailing behind me. To my horror, he was only 5 feet away. I ran faster than I've ever ran before. I could hear his footsteps behind me thumping across the concrete as he ran too. I dove down an alleyway I knew well and tried to lose him in a park, making my way home longer. I could hear his heavy breath followed by his footsteps as he tried to keep up. I cut through houses, backyards, and front yards. I finally made it to my house and flew up the steps. I looked behind me and he had just arrived at the bottom of my stairs. I unlocked the door and burst through it, shoving it closed behind me, and I heard him hit the door with his whole body. I ran around the house and locked all the windows, turned off the lights, and hid in my bedroom with a kitchen knife, just in case he got in. He wasn't lucky. If this was a better world, that's where my story would end. But it doesn't. After a few months, I haven't really told anyone what's happened since I don't want to get in trouble with my parents for sneaking out or anything. I didn't go out with anyone or any group anymore, and my loner status returned. I began to write horror stories as a coping mechanism, and never went out past 7. It was around February when a classmate of mine was sharing a story of some random man following her home on the bus. She described him almost the exact same way as the man who had chased me home. Another girl mentioned that he sounded like the guy who stood outside the school and tried to follow her home. I didn't join in, but everyone agreed that he was just a weird guy. He was kind of forgotten, and eventually I moved on too. Then, around May, I was getting ready to walk to school when my mom pulled me aside and showed me a picture of a man. The guy who stalked me, actually. She told me that he had been arrested 2 weeks ago for sexually assaulting a child and had escaped last night. She told me to keep an eye out for him and to call the cops if I saw him. I was shaking the whole time I walked to school. It haunts me to know that if he had caught me, I would most likely be in her position or even dead. So, creepy nighttime stalker who liked to hunt down young girls and sexually assault them, let's not meet again.